I want to talk a little bit about rendering. So what you can see here is that I'm getting a decent view of this in the viewport, but if I wanted to tweak lights, or if I wanted to tweak things like just rendering parameters in general, then oftentimes you want to do that in a higher fidelity view. You want to actually see a software render representation of that. So because I'm using Arnold, I can also use the new Arnold render view, which is a really awesome render view that allows you to see kind of the high quality, high fidelity representation of your scene and your animation, and it's progressively refined. And what that means, it also ties back into the scene. What that means is I can actually scrub my scene and I can see a really rough render representation of the scene. And then when I want to see a particular image, I can just stop right there, and then Arnold will continue to progressively refine that image for me kind of in the background. So it's a really, really handy way of going in and kind of quickly viewing particular frames in general. And then of course this is all interactive, so if I wanted to go in and grab a light and then maybe start to play with the coloring of this light, whatever, we'll just add like a maybe yellow light, and I can see the effect of that yellow light. Obviously that doesn't look good, so I'm going to go back in and change that back to a white light. But I can tweak things like intensity of the light interactively. I can tweak things like the shader parameters if I wanted to adjust things like ambient occlusion or transparency. I can go in and play with the shader parameters and actually see those update very quickly with the progressive Arnold render view. So we have a batch render, which is under the rendering menu set, and what that will allow you to do is render an Arnold sequence. Now this does actually freeze the UI temporarily while it renders. You can actually run a second instance of Maya if you want to work while it's rendering. But essentially this is batching a render out through the Maya UI. But of course it takes your local resources. Now you may want to actually render something really complex, or you may want to render a lot of frames, but you don't have either the computers to manage a farm, or maybe you just don't have the time, even if you do have the computers. So what you can do now is use Google Zinc. So we've partnered with Google to support cloud rendering via Arnold or RenderMan or V-Ray. And the way it works basically is that you run a simple little utility locally, and this becomes your client. This runs and this kind of communicates with the Google server in the background, or the Google services, I should say. Then you also get a shelf, a Zinc shelf, that you load into Maya, and then you click that and it will bring up the Zinc render parameters, which are pretty straightforward. So basically what you do is you define the number of machines. So you can say, I want to render on 10 machines, and I want to render on the most basic hardware, which is 8 cores and 16 gigs of RAM. But you can also go all the way up to something like 32 cores and 64 gigs of RAM, and the price will vary depending on the CPU power that you choose, basically. But you can use as many machines as you want. I could do 5 or I could do 100. And then there's a cost calculator where it'll link you to the website, and it'll basically help you calculate how much it's going to cost to render a certain sequence. It's very cost efficient. You don't have to manage a render farm. You don't have to have an IT guy that deals with all the complexities of a render farm. You don't have to buy the licenses for a render farm, yet you have access on demand to what is the equivalent of a render farm. You set your frame ranges. You can use multiple layers here, and then you ultimately just link it to your Google account. You say launch job, and what that will do is it will open up a web browser, or actually you have to open up the web browser, but once you open the web browser you can see all the jobs that have been uploaded. So you can see earlier today I uploaded a sequence from this render. It tells me the file that was uploaded, it tells me which camera, how many frames I'm going to be rendering, and then it shows you down here which machines are working on which frames. So this machine is working on frames 1 to 10, this machine is working on frames 11 to 20, and it works like Dropbox, where once you link it to your account, once these frames are rendered, it automatically downloads and syncs your project with what has been rendered on the Google server. That whole process of uploading files and downloading files is completely transparent and completely seamless, and you don't ever actually really have to think about it. It just updates in the background on the fly. So it's pretty cool. Actually, I've used it quite a bit. I've been having fun with it, having access to all these machines. So I want to finish off with a couple of things. One more thing about rendering. while you're rendering, by default, what you're going to be doing, if I were just to go in here and say render sequence, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be rendering out an animation of everything in my scene. So if I were to take a look at the images folder for this particular project, which is where everything goes, it'll create a folder that contains essentially all the 3D elements of that given scene. And if I kind of thumb through these images, you can see it's the logo itself with the transparency effect, and then it's the text that's been animated on. All that gets rendered together. Oftentimes you of course want to break this up into layers that can be composited and then also tweaked in the compositor. The way you do that is you essentially create what are called render layers, or layers within what's called render setup, I should say, which is a new system. We had an old render layer system that is still available, although I doubt you'll need to use it because the new one is much improved. And the way it works basically is it's all token based. You start by creating some layers. So I'll create one layer for the logo, and I'll create another layer for the text. And as many other elements as I might have, you just create a new layer. And for that layer, you create what's called a collection. And the collection is basically just a collection of nodes that are part of the layer. It's really as simple as it is. So you take a collection, and then you basically grab an object and you just say add to that collection. And now when I isolate that layer, you can see it isolates only the objects that are associated with that layer. Now another way that we can work is through tokens and naming. So what you can see here is as the text flies in, actually let me turn that on. I need to give myself a little more space here just because of the resolution of the webcast, but there you can see the text coming in. That's not part of that layer, but I want it to be part of this layer. So what I can do is I can just say anything with the word, not text, but type star, I want to be included in this collection. So now when I isolate this particular layer, you can see that it will include anything that has the word type in it. So what that means is that if I were to go in and create some new type, and let's just do something really quick here. I'll bring up my motion graphics shelf and I'll just create some new type, and it doesn't really matter what's in it, but you'll notice that the new type I created has the word type in it, which means that if I isolate this layer, it automatically gets added to that layer because of its naming convention. So it's a very nice, simple way of managing the objects in your scene. If you keep track of naming and whatnot and are fairly well organized, this is a very nice approach. It also works very well with things like file referencing. It doesn't break very easily, whereas the old render layer system was a little bit more clunky, for lack of a better word, under the hood. You can also create overrides, so if you want different shaders for different layers, or if you want to change particular values like transparency or like glow, diffuse, or anything really, you can actually do that as an override on the layer so that the layer itself would contain some modification on top of what's in the base scene, and that's really straightforward and easy to set up. But ultimately, what you're going to be doing is rendering this out. So now when I go into render sequence, because I have those layers set up, as long as I tell it to render those layers, instead of just rendering out a frame or a series of frames that contains all of the things in my scene like we saw before, it's going to render out some companion folders, and it will tag them with an RS. RS stands for render setup. So I have render setup logo, and that of course contains the logo animation. So if I take a look at that, it's the logo animation without any text. And if I instead load the RS text, that's going to be the opposite. It's going to give me the text animation without the actual logo.